welcome. My name is Peter Andreas. I'm here at the Watson Institute and also in the Political Science Department. This is part of the Security Seminar Series, also in this case appropriately co-sponsored by the Middle East Studies Program and Bashar Germani, Director. It's my great pleasure to welcome back to the Watson Institute and Brown University Andrew Bacevich, who's just up the street at Boston University, talking to us about his latest book. It seems you have a new book every 2 or 3 years. This one's particularly timely, America's War for the Greater Middle East, A Military History. And in fact, there will be a book signing immediately after the talk outside. If you've already seen, there's a nice stack of books waiting for you all after the talk. Just a very brief introduction. Andrew Bacevich is a retired professor of history and international relations at Boston University. He's a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy and served for 23 years as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Army. He received his PhD in American diplomatic history from Princeton, and before joining the faculty of Boston University in 1998, he taught at West Point and at Johns Hopkins. His 3 most recent books, I don't know the full number of books, but his 3 most recent are Breach of Trust, Washington Rules, and the Limits of Power, and very rare for an academic, all hit the New York Times bestseller list, and I certainly hope the most recent one does as well. So let's welcome him to Watson.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thanks very much for turning out. So I've been traveling the country trying to get people to notice that I've actually published a book. I mean, some of you at least know how hard it is to write a book. I've now concluded that the one thing that's harder than writing a book is getting somebody to know that you actually wrote a book. Everywhere I go to talk about the book, we get to the Q&A, and really inevitably somebody will ask, okay, smart guy, what do you recommend that we should be doing about ISIS? And I have to say that in some respects, the purpose of the book is to suggest that that's the wrong question. And I'm reminded of a moment in the Vietnam War. Some of you are old enough to remember the Vietnam War and may recall that back in the winter of 1967 to 1968, there was a question being asked at that moment that, in a sense, was the equivalent of today's question, what should we do about ISIS? And the question then was, can Khe Sanh hold? And some of you will remember that Khe Sanh was a Marine garrison located in the very northern part of South Vietnam. 2 North Vietnamese Army divisions had surrounded the Marines at Khe Sanh, who were greatly outnumbered. And press commentary at the time drew all sorts of comparisons between Khe Sanh and Dien Bien Phu, an earlier battle, one fought back in 1954. Then a besieged and outnumbered French garrison had fallen to the Viet Minh, and that defeat had decided the French Indochina War. So we were asking ourselves back in late 1967 and early 1968, was this history about to repeat itself at Khe Sanh? Well, in the event, the Marines did hold, and the United States lost the war anyway. So in retrospect, it seems pretty clear to me that back in 1967 and early 1968, we were asking the wrong question. Rather than focusing on the fate of the garrison at Khe Sanh, the American public should have been asking questions like these. Does the Vietnam War make sense? Is it winnable? And if not, why are we there? And perhaps ultimately, does no alternative exist to simply pressing on with a policy that shows no sign of success? And I believe today we find ourselves in a comparable situation. What to do about ISIS is a non-trivial question, but it pales in comparison to other questions that we have for too long ignored. Does waging war across a large swath of the Islamic world make sense? Is that war in any meaningful sense winnable? And if not, why are we there? And most of all, is there no alternative? So my book provides an account of America's war for the greater Middle East that tries to call attention to these more fundamental questions. It suggests that before answering the ISIS questions, we should consider how we got where we are today, which necessarily requires evaluating what prior U.S. military efforts in this region of the world have yielded and at what cost. So my book tells the story of what has come to be an immense military enterprise, a war for the greater Middle East that began in 1980 and is still underway today. Well, why cite 1980 as the start point? In January of that year, President Jimmy Carter, certainly our least bellicose president of the last half century or more, in January of that year, Jimmy Carter used the occasion of his State of the Union address to designate the Persian Gulf a vital U.S. national security interest. In layperson's terms, a place that the United States was now willing to fight for. This Carter Doctrine, as it came to be known, touched off the process of militarizing U.S. policy, not only in the Persian Gulf, but across much of the Islamic world, eventually landing the United States in a state of permanent war. We forget, I think, that prior to 1980, there really were two parts of the world that the United States was willing to fight for. One of those was Western Europe. The United States maintained very substantial military forces in Western Europe in order to deter or contain the Soviet Union. But prior to 1980, the United States had also demonstrated its willingness to fight in East Asia. We had fought two very substantial wars, first in Korea and then in Vietnam, and had continued to maintain significant forces there in the event of a requirement to fight again. But prior to 1980, the attention that the Pentagon had given to the Persian Gulf was minimal. There were no plans, and there was no capability, no significant capability to fight there. Well, now all that began to change. So the narrative I tell unfolds chronologically. It begins with the failed Iran hostage rescue attempt 36 years ago this month. And the narrative concludes with the now renewed Gulf War. By my count, that is the fourth Gulf War in which the United States has been engaged over the last several decades. I say the book concludes, but obviously the war has not concluded, and we can surely expect that there will be more campaigns to come. I mean, cynically, that may be good news for me because, that'll let me put out a second or a third edition of this ever-growing volume. Along the way, the book tries to answer four questions. First, what motivated the United States to act as it has? Second, what have the civilians responsible for formulating policy and the soldiers charged with implementing policy sought to accomplish? Third, regardless of their intentions, what actually ensued? And fourth, with what consequences? In short, the book links aims to actions to outcomes. The central theme of my story can be briefly stated. A nation priding itself in having the world's greatest military, and we certainly do have the world's greatest military, perhaps history's greatest military. But that nation has misused its military power on an epic scale. It's not simply that we have not prevailed, although obviously we have not. Rather, it is that through a combination of naivete, short-sightedness, and hubris, we have actually made matters worse at very considerable cost to ourselves and to others. Well, what has this war been about? In a narrow sense, it began as a war for oil. Yet even from the outset, much more was at stake than ensuring access to the cheap gas that fuels the American way of life. From day one, the larger purpose, in my judgment, of America's war for the greater Middle East has been to affirm that we are a people to whom limits do not apply. Through a war that now extends well into the 21st century, the United States has sought to validate or affirm the outcome of the 20th century, at least as Americans like to remember that century. As enshrined in our collective memory, that outcome, the outcome of the 20th century, testifies to American global preeminence: political, military, economic, cultural, ideological. That outcome also asserts a claim to privileges, above all, to freedom, abundance, and security, the privilege of claiming for ourselves more than our fair share of freedom, abundance, and security. Indeed, these have become to define our birthright, at least as most Americans believe. Well, starting with the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, which occurred in December of that same year, events in the greater Middle East have seemed to challenge such expectations. And following in the wake of the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet incursion came a sequence of events, not least of all the 9/11 attacks, suggesting that the so-called American century might have been a fluke, or worse still, a fiction. The ultimate purpose of our war for the greater Middle East has been to refute any such suspicions. Nominally, the U.S. troops dispatched to invade, occupy, garrison, bomb, or raid various parts of the Islamic world since 1980 have sought to punish the wicked, protect the innocent, and spread liberal values. Their advertised purpose has been to liberate, defend, or deter. Yet their actual purpose has been far more ambitious. The real mission has been to sustain claims to American exceptionalism that have long since become central to our self-identity, to bring into compliance with American purposes the revolutionaries, warlords, terrorists, despots, or bad actors of various stripe given to defiance. To employ Washington-style jargon, back in 1980, the United States set out in willy-nilly fashion to shape the greater Middle East. Well, given the conditions existing there, employing military means to bring the region into conformity with American purposes has indeed resulted in an undertaking of breathtaking scope. Over time, it has found U.S. forces in action everywhere from Iran and Iraq, Lebanon and Libya, Somalia and Sudan, Bosnia and Kosovo, Afghanistan and Pakistan, now Syria, and the list goes on. Along the way, we tried overwhelming force and shock and awe. We invaded, occupied, and took a stab at nation building. We experimented with counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, regime change and decapitation, peacekeeping and humanitarian intervention, retaliatory strikes and preventive attack, even something that the Air Force called air occupation. That was their description of our posture relative to Iraq during the 1990s. U.S. forces operated overtly, covertly, and through proxies. Almost certainly, U.S. forces went places and did things about which the American public today remains completely in the dark. Unfortunately, throughout this period of time, no administration ever devised a plausible strategy for achieving American aims. Each administration, in turn, simply reacted to situations that it confronted. Nor has any administration made available the means needed to make good on the grandiose ambitions that it entertained. Indeed, on the U.S. side, one of this conflict's abiding qualities has been its paltriness. Today, the problems besetting the greater Middle East are substantially greater than they were when substantial numbers of U.S. forces first began venturing into the region. and ISIS offers but one example of the results. We may argue over the underlying sources of those problems, but there is no arguing that U.S. efforts to alleviate the dysfunction so much in evidence have failed. To address the situation that the United States, facing the United States in the greater Middle East, there are really two plausible approaches, it seems to me. The first of those approaches is to wait things out, insulating yourself from the problem's worst effects while promoting a nonviolent solution from within. This requires patience and comes with no guarantee of ultimate success. And with all the usual caveats attached, this is the approach that the United States took during the Cold War. The second approach is more direct. It aims to eliminate the problem through sustained, relentless military action. This approach entails less patience, but incurs greater near-term sacrifices. And after a certain amount of shilly-shallying, it was this head-on approach that the Union employed to win the Civil War. In its war for the greater Middle East, the United States chose neither to contain nor to crush. Instead, it charted a course midway in between. In effect, it chose aggravation. With politicians and generals too quick to declare victory, and with the American public too quick to throw in the towel when faced with adversity, U.S. forces rarely stayed long enough to finish the job. And I say that notwithstanding the fact that in Iraq and Afghanistan, we stayed a length of time that makes those two conflicts the longest wars in our entire history. But instead of intimidating, U.S. military efforts have annoyed, incited, and generally communicated a lack of commitment and resolve. In the ultimate irony, the circumstances initially making the Persian Gulf worth fighting for have ceased to pertain. If today the American way of life still depends, whether for better or for worse, on having access to plentiful reserves of oil and natural gas, then defending Canada and Venezuela should take precedence over defending Saudi Arabia and Iraq. Even so, shorn of its initial rationale, the war for the greater Middle East continues as if on autopilot. That the ongoing enterprise may someday end, that U.S. troops may finally actually come home, appears so unlikely as to make that prospect unworthy of discussion. Certainly it's not discussed in any meaningful way in the course of the ongoing U.S. presidential campaign. Like the war on drugs or the war on poverty, the war for the greater Middle East has become a fixture in American life and is broadly accepted as such. Among the factors contributing to the lack of any serious challenge to the war's perpetuation, it seems to me that four stand out. The first of those factors is the absence of an anti-war or anti-interventionist political party worthy of the name. The ongoing war has long since acquired a perfidious seal of bipartisan approval. As such, the two major parties are equally disinclined to probe too deeply into its origins, conduct, or prospects. Many of you probably saw the article in yesterday's New York Times Magazine describing Hillary Clinton as a hawk, relatively well substantiated charge, and evidence of exactly what I mean. True, a second reason is that politicians aspiring to high office find it more expedient to support the troops and therefore the war than to question the war's efficacy. A particular campaign that goes awry, like Somalia in 1983, or the occupation of Iraq after the invasion of 2003, or the chaos created by the intervention in Libya in 2011, a campaign that goes awry may attract brief attention, but never the context in which that campaign occurred. To put it in another way, the war for the greater Middle East awaits its Eugene McCarthy or its George McGovern. The third reason for the war's perpetuation is that some individuals and institutions actually benefit from an armed conflict that drags on and on. Those benefits are immediate and they are tangible. They come in the form of profits, jobs, and campaign contributions. For the military-industrial complex and its beneficiaries, perpetual war is not necessarily bad news. But finally, and I think most importantly, there is this. Thus far, at least, Americans themselves appear oblivious to what is occurring. Policymakers having successfully insulated the public from the war's worst negative effects. In a fundamental sense, the war is not our concern. But here's the rub. In the 21st century, the prerequisites of freedom, abundance, and security are changing. Geopolitically, Asia is eclipsing in importance all the other regions of the world, apart perhaps from North America itself. And the emerging problem set that we confront, coping, for example, with the effects of climate change, the emerging problem set is itself global and will require a global response. Whether or not Americans are able to preserve the privileged position to which they are accustomed will depend on how well the United States adapts itself to these fresh circumstances. Amidst such challenges, the afflictions besetting large portions of the Islamic world will undoubtedly persist, but their relative importance to the United States as determinants of American well-being will diminish. In this context, the war for the Greater Middle East becomes a diversion that Americans can ill afford. To fancy at this point that the U.S. military possesses the capacity to shape the course of events there is an absurdity. And indulging that absurdity further serves chiefly to impede the ability of the United States to attend to more pressing concerns. Ultimately, it seems to me, the game that really matters will play itself out here at home rather than in some far-off place like Iraq or Afghanistan. Whether the United States is able to shape the Greater Middle East will matter less than whether it can reshape itself, restoring effectiveness to self-government, providing for sustainable and equitable prosperity, and extracting from a vastly diverse culture something to hold in common of greater moment than shallow digital enthusiasms and the worship of celebrity. Don't get me started on Prince. Perpetuating the war for the Greater Middle East is not enhancing American freedom, abundance, and security. If anything, it is having just the opposite effect. And one day, the American people may awaken to this reality. Then and only then will the war end. When this awakening will occur is impossible to say. For now, sadly, Americans remain deep in slumber. Thank you very much. So I talked even briefer than I thought I was going to, but that's good news for you. There's two options. One is it's good news because we can have a longer discussion. The second is we can adjourn early and there's going to be refreshments outside, or some combination thereof. Anyway, I look forward to your comments and questions. Yes, sir.
How would you factor in American support, embrace of the state of Israel and Israel's policy in your calculus?
There's two. I said I always get asked about ISIS. That's true. Then there's two other questions I always get. One of you will ask me the draft question, right? Who's going to ask me the draft question? Okay. And then somebody always asks the Israel question. So we got the Israel question up front.
You can answer the draft one too.
I'll give him a chance to pose it. I think it is a great mistake to explain the problem that we've got ourselves in terms of the state of Israel. I do, however, think that there is great merit in acknowledging that in very important ways, the interests of the United States and the interests of the state of Israel do not align, indeed have diverged substantially over the last 20 years. And that no purpose is served by indulging in the sort of rhetoric we hear in speeches made at APEC that, never will there be any light between the United States and Israel, and we are soul brothers or soul sisters or soul somethings forever. And when I say that interests have diverged, I mean quite specifically on matters related to the prospects of a two-state solution. From an American perspective, I'm an American, that's the perspective I take. From an American perspective, I think the United States really has a profound interest in addressing the grievances of the Palestinians. And that can only be done by bringing about the creation of a genuinely sovereign state for the Palestinian people. Why do we don't have, that's an interest, this is an interest that doesn't derive somehow from particular concerns of justice. I have to say, I don't really think that U.S. policy is motivated by concerns of justice to any great extent. It's an interest because the grievances of the Palestinian people are continuously cited by people from the Islamic world as explaining the depth of hostility and animosity directed at the West and directed against the United States specifically. And we have an interest in testing that proposition. On the other hand, I'm not an Israeli Jew. On the other hand, it seems to me that from the point of view of the Jewish majority in Israel, there is no such profound interest in addressing the grievances of the Palestinian. Indeed, were I an Israeli Jew, I would oppose the two-state solution. Why? Because as far as I can tell, things in Israel today are actually pretty darn good. And why put that at risk from an Israeli Jewish perspective? Why put that at risk by taking a chance on a sovereign Palestinian state turning out to be a responsible neighbor that they can live alongside peacefully? So I think we have differences. And I think we should be candid about those differences, not because candor in and of itself is going to lead to a solution, but because it seems to me pretending otherwise is never going to lead to a solution, and indeed is likely to exacerbate a situation that from my point of view, we should view as increasingly intolerable. That's my answer to your question, sir. Yes?
I would like to ask you a question. I have read your book, Breach of Trust, and I wanted to ask you a question about your positions on American interventions that happened in the 1990s in Somalia and, of course, in the former Yugoslavia and Kosovo and Bosnia, and also about the 2011 airstrikes in Libya during Libya's civil war.
You're going to have me basically summarize the entire book.
But I wanted to ask you specifically about those because you were critical of U.S. policy there. But I wanted to ask you about what your potential solution, or if the U.S. should have not have done anything at all, because if we hadn't done anything, you could very reasonably argue that many, many more people would have died as a result of those conflicts. In particular, Bosnia, where the Serbs were conducting ethnic genocide. And I wanted to ask you, what would your policy decision
so
at the time would have
point
been?
number one,
Yeah.
I'm a historian. I'm not a policy analyst. The book is a history book. I began my talk by explaining what are the questions I try to answer. I'm trying to answer a set of questions about why we did what we did, with what expectations and what resulted. So let me just lay that out, number one. Number two, although the book tries to provide a historian's analytical account of a now long series of interventions, large and small, brief and protracted, the overarching aim of the exercise is to try to persuade you as potential readers that all of these episodes are linked together and deserve to be seen as a war for the greater Middle East. So it's quite legitimate, I think, to say, let's talk about a specific episode and what we did and what resulted. But I would simply emphasize, it seems to me that to the extent that our discussion of U.S. military policy focuses on individual campaigns or actions, then it seems to me we miss the larger significance we miss the larger failure, we're more likely to indulge in a continuation of the war, which again, to my mind, would be a mistake. So you cited about 5 different campaigns. I think the first one you mentioned was the Somalia intervention of 1992 to 93. Many of you remember that. George Herbert Walker Bush, having been defeated for re-election, announced that the United States was going to undertake a humanitarian intervention in Somalia, where very considerable starvation was going on, in order to try to create sufficient order for relief supplies to be delivered and distributed to the people who needed them. So he initiated this enterprise and then handed it off to his successor, rather slyly handed it off to his successor, Bill Clinton, who by the time he became president on January 20th of 1993, had inherited an intervention that nominally had succeeded. Nominally succeeded in the sense that the conditions leading to starvation did not exist on January 1993. Sufficient order had been imposed, relief supplies were being distributed. Of course, Bill Clinton's problem was, what do we do now? And what Bill Clinton chose to do, and to me, this is where we get to me the significance, what Bill Clinton chose to do is to say, well, we're going to undertake a nation-building campaign so that when we withdraw, the conditions giving rise to starvation will not recur. His decision to do that, his decision to try to shape one particular country, triggered a war directed against the United States. It was a small-scale war. It was a war conducted by a warlord. Alas, conducted by a warlord who had very significant military advantages, in part because his battlefield was a city, Mogadishu, that for all practical purposes he controlled. The American military response, because Clinton basically escalated the campaign, the American military response was based on the expectation that the world's greatest military would be able to deal in short order with disorganized militants, lightly armed, lacking in discipline, lacking in heavy equipment, lacking in sophisticated communications, lacking in the kind of staffs that we have, and that basically a relatively small additional increment of American military power could solve the problem. You know the outcome. The outcome was the firefight of Mogadishu in October of 1983, which we lost. Bill Clinton acknowledged that loss by cutting his losses politically, pulling out, fired the Secretary of Defense as the fall guy. 2 things came out of that in my judgment. One thing was a lesson for a guy named bin Laden, who learned in Mogadishu that the Americans could be had. And the second one is, the second thing that came out was a refusal on the part of the United States military to acknowledge the extent that in fighting irregular forces in an urban environment, the U.S. does so at a significant disadvantage. Now, because I'm a historian, I'm trying to explain what happened and what it means, I can't tell you. And frankly, I would not venture to guess what would have happened in Somalia had the United States never entered. I don't know. All I know is what happened when the United States did intervene, and what I think I know is how that failed intervention then connected to and contributed to subsequent U.S. military interventions, all of which, at least in my view, deserve to be seen as part of this larger war. That make sense? So rather than going through all the other campaigns, I'll let somebody else ask a question if that's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman there wants to ask the draft question, so we might as well get that one out of the way.
I guess I'm going to ask it a little differently. Would you consider the current disconnect between the American public and the military and military operations unique in American history? And if so, I'm just wondering, why do you think that might be so?
That's a great question. and it is the draft question, but it's never been posed to me that way, and so I have to stop and think for a second, because you said, are there any other comparable instances? And of course, the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War produced separation between between the public and the military, or at least portions of the public. I should say portions of the public and the military. But the character of that separation was very substantially different from the separation that exists today. I mean, the separation that exists today is one in which the average American citizen walks around saying, we see soldiers, we say, thank you for your, I'm having my house painted inside. You don't want to do this, okay? Just ruins your life for a whole week. And the guy, wonderful guy, the guy who's doing the paint, wonderful guy. And he says to me today, I know your background. Thank you for your service. And I said, thank you very much. But this kind of gets to part of the problem here. There is no animus directed against American soldiers today, as there was in some quarters during the Vietnam era. And I'm glad that there is no animus directed against American soldiers. There should not be. They are merely instruments of the state. They don't design the wars. They don't choose the wars they're sent to fight. But neither should there be this sort of, forgive me if I don't want to offend anybody, this sort of cheap rhetorical expressions of appreciation. Rather, the relationship between the people in the American military ought to elicit support, but it ought to be serious support, substantive support. Support by people engaged in and concerned about what the state sends American soldiers to do and with what consequences. And that doesn't exist today. I mean, again, to repeat myself, I am appalled by the absence of any serious discussion over how this war has evolved over such a long period of time, putting us in a position where war has become a normal condition and is not even discussed. But your question was, are there any historical comparisons? I don't think so. We're in a very, this post-Cold War relationship between the U.S. military and American society, I think really is unique in our history.
And why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I wrote a book about that called The New American Militarism, which came out now 11 years ago. And the argument presented in the book is as follows. This will save you from having to buy a copy. There was no militarism back, let's say, the American militarism didn't exist in 1968 or 1969 or 1970. Because the Vietnam War had if anything, created a considerable anti-military mood. But by the time we get to the turn of the 21st century, that anti-military mood had vanished and had been replaced by what I characterized as militarism, that is to say, exaggerated expectations of what American military power can achieve, a tendency to see military power as our strong suit, our preferred option, a tendency to see soldiers, I think this is less apparent here in 2016 than it was in 2005, a tendency to see soldiers as the bearers of the nation's charisma, sort of the vessels of rectitude and virtue. And so I think militarism, and so then the burden of the book is to say, well, where'd that come from? And where it came from was a variety of factors that coincided. One of them was the officer corps in which I served, which was determined to embark upon a reform effort to restore its status in American society, that status having been badly damaged as a consequence of the Vietnam War. It is interesting, of course, today that in every poll that measures trust and confidence in major American institutions, the military comes in first, far and away, above churches. Of course, as a Catholic, I should say I understand that. Why? But so that aspect of the military's effort to recover worked. Militarism came about as a product of the arrival on the national political stage of conservative Christian evangelicals. It came about as a result, partly as a result of the rise of neoconservatism, a group of ideologues confident in their ability to use American military power to advance a particular ideological agenda, to remake the world in our image. It came about in part because of the rise of Ronald Reagan, part of whose charm, he did charm us. Part of his charm was the way Reagan embraced the soldier as the embodiment of all that is good in the United States. It came apart in part because of the interpretation that we chose to assign to the end of the Cold War. Why did the Cold War end the way it did? My personal view, it ended the way it did because Marxism-Leninism was always flawed and was doomed to fail, and it took until the 1980s for that failure actually to occur. That's not the interpretation preferred by most Americans. The interpretation preferred by most Americans is the Cold War ended the way it did because we won, right? USA, USA. And why did we win? Because Gorbachev took a look at the growing might of the American military and decided to throw in the towel. I think it's an utterly false interpretation, but it's one that I think plays well amongst Americans who like to believe that we dominate. So it came about as a result of a variety of conditions, and now you don't have to read the book. Yes, sir.
Dr. Bacevich, thank you very much. I really appreciate how you invite us to think about the events within the arc. So let me ask about the arc, if I may. Why does the arc begin in 1980 and not, say, in 1953 when there was a coup in Iran that we facilitated?
This is the fourth question I always get.
But let
you're
me
right,
ask
right,
you.
yes.
Let me ask you the follow-up, which maybe you haven't gotten. So, but maybe it's the fifth most popular.
Yeah.
And that is the Iran nuclear agreement part of the arc or part of its departure?
Great. Okay. So first question is the subtitle. Does anybody have a copy of my new book on their desk?
I think it was the Greater War for the Middle East was the subtitle.
No, that's the title. The subtitle is A Military History. So the reason it starts in 1980, and I mean I make reference to these earlier events, is that this is a story of what the United States has done with its military in the Greater Middle East. I do not, I hope I didn't imply that there was no U.S. policy or U.S. interest in or U.S. involvement in this part of the world before 1980, because that would be not true. And indeed, the event that you refer to, the Anglo-American coup that overthrows Mossadegh and reinstalls the Shah in power, is very much part of the larger narrative. It's just, in my judgment, not part of our military history in the region. So that's why I choose to start it. I'm interested in number one, making the point that there was a time, now forgotten, when U.S. policy in the region was not militarized. It may not have been wise, but it didn't rely on bombing people and invading their countries. And then after 1980, increasingly, bombing people and invading countries comes to be central to U.S. policy. So it is the military history that is my focus. Now the Iran deal, many of you read the now famous Jeffrey Goldberg article in The Atlantic called the Obama Doctrine it was called, right? If you haven't read it, you should. Atlantic Magazine. Make sure that you allot yourself plenty of time, probably a scotch sitting next to you on the table. It's 19,000 words long, this article. But it is an excellent article. And it's an excellent article, I think, because you get an appreciation. I mean, I voted for the president twice, A, B. I think his administration on balance has been a disappointment. But what you get from this article is an appreciation of the education of Barack Obama in the art of statecraft. And you see somebody who has come to acquire, in my personal opinion, an immensely sophisticated understanding of the way the world works. And very impressively, somebody who disdains what he refers to in the article as the Washington playbook. That is to say, sort of the standard repertoire of things that we are supposed to do or things we're supposed to say. You know, that Saudi Arabia is our ally, that Iraq is our friend from now, or that Israel is our friend from now to the end of time. He's somebody who's rejected that. And in that context, I think that the Iran nuclear deal has the potential to be the most significant aspect of his approach to statecraft. Why do I say that? And others, I think, make the same point. So it's not like this is original with me. That the purpose of the Iran nuclear deal was only marginally to try to ensure that Iran did not acquire a nuclear weapon. But the real purpose of the Iran nuclear deal is to hand Iran an opportunity. And the opportunity is one that says, if you would choose to, you may end your isolation and become once more part of the international community. Why would he do that? I think he does that because he won't say it, but he acknowledges the failure of the enterprise that I describe in this book. And he is looking for a way out. And the way out is for nations in the region to be able to manage regional affairs, which is really a way of saying to look to nations in the region to negotiate an equilibrium of power that will enable them to coexist. Not necessarily in peace, harmony, and the brotherhood of man, but to get along with one another. There cannot be an equilibrium of power as long as Iran, an important actor, is excluded. There can be if Iran's in, but it's an opportunity. Why would he make the bet? And I think it's a huge bet. I think he's making the bet because he's got a read of the direction of Iranian politics that says that the future is going to be defined by the millions of young Iranians who we know. Stephen Kinzer wrote about this in his last visit. When did you last visit there?
1 year ago.
That we know are oriented favorably toward the West, towards modernity. That they want to be part of the modern world. And there are millions and millions and millions of them. Obama is betting that they define the future rather than the clerics and the ayatollahs and the people who, it would appear, are not particularly interested in becoming part of modernity. But it's a bet. And my guess is that the bet that we won't know how this bet is going to play out for 10 years, 20 years. It's easy right now to make a case that says the bet's not working. There's all kinds of mischief going on. It would appear to be that the Iranians are involved in that aren't necessarily, things not necessarily to our liking. But he's playing a long game. And I think it's a courageous, creative enterprise. And if it plays out, history will judge him favorably. If he turns out he gets it wrong, then he'll rank at the absolute bottom level of American presidents. Pretty brave just to take the shot. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you for a very impressive argument. But I want to ask you to look a bit more in detail. That is, if I take the question a bit more general than our policy in the Middle East. There have been, since the Second World War, quite different attitudes of presidents, political parties, and so on. There is Eisenhower with his warning against the military-industrial complex.
Right.
There was, I would say, Clinton, in spite of Somalia, he was hesitant to do grandiose things. There was the elder Bush who was hesitant, in contrast to his son. And so maybe you could comment a little bit on these various people who had hesitation about the military involvement of the United States in the wider world, and ask the question of how were they not quite successful?
Well, with respect, I think I disagree with the premise of the question. Notwithstanding the failure of Somalia, Bill Clinton intervened in Bosnia. Bill Clinton intervened in Kosovo. Bill Clinton maintained this policy of armed containment of Iraq. We all ignored this, right? But armed aircraft flying over Iraq from in the northern and southern fly zones every day, and frequently expending ordnance. Bill Clinton retaliated directly against Baghdad on at least 2 occasions. The second one being Operation Desert Fox in 1998. You were there. Bill Clinton began ineffectively, began waging war against al-Qaeda. You remember that the cruise missile attacks against al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan, accompanied by the bizarre episode of destroying a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum. So with regard to the frequency with which Bill Clinton used force in the greater Middle East, the record is impressive. With regard to the benefits achieved, then it's somewhat of a mixed record. An argument can be made that on balance, the Bosnia and Kosovo interventions were successful. Certainly they were successful in the sense that of ending the war against the Bosnian Muslims, and also successful in creating opportunity for Kosovo to ultimately achieve independence, even though we insisted that's not what our purpose was. Those interventions, however, were not successful in redressing some of the animus directed against the United States elsewhere in the Muslim world. In other words, those who thought that coming to the aid of Bosnian Muslims and Kosovars were disappointed by the results. So it seems to me that, again, I disagree with the premise. With regard to George Herbert Walker Bush, a one-term president, we can only judge by his actions over the course of a 4-year period, right? Wrapped up U.S. involvement in what I term the first Gulf War. That's the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, where we intervened on behalf of Saddam Hussein, right? Then waged the second Gulf War against Saddam Hussein once Saddam invaded Kosovo. I would certainly agree that. What did I say? Yeah, that would have been quite a leap. Iraqi airborne forces parachuting into Kosovo. Kuwait, sorry. This isn't being recorded though, so that's a blooper that will not be held against me. Yeah. I think it was appropriate for the United States to respond to the invasion of Kuwait as it did. I don't have a problem with that at all. But it has to be acknowledged that that war, for all its battlefield success, resulted in an exceedingly ambiguous outcome. Because Saddam Hussein survived, wasn't supposed to, did. His survival then drew the United States much more deeply into, militarily into, the affairs of the region. We ended up with the no-fly zones. We ended up with a mission to protect the Kurds. Most significantly, we ended up maintaining very substantial U.S. forces in the region, specifically in Saudi Arabia, land of the two holy places, which became the incentive, created an incentive for attacks against U.S. forces and U.S. interests. Khobar Towers bombing, the two attacks on the African embassies, the attack on the USS Cole in 2000. And the argument here, because I'm a historian, I'm not somebody who tries to figure out what might have happened otherwise, the argument here is that despite the nominal success of the second Gulf War by George Herbert Walker Bush, that war yielded a set of unintended, unanticipated consequences that yielded negative outcomes for us.
Thank you for the talk. And I look forward to reading the book. I obviously haven't read it yet, but just a couple questions. One is, am I right that you include Bosnia and Kosovo in the book?
I do.
And if so, it's not intuitively obvious why you would do so other than the fact that Muslim majority populations and,
That's it.
okay.
I mean,
If you could say-
I begin the chapter by saying, hey, wait a second. Mexico. Now, Mexico is located in North America, right? But Mexico is also part of Latin America, isn't it? And I think the same thing applies to the Balkans. Clearly, the Balkans are, viewed from one perspective, the Balkans are part of Europe. Yugoslavia was a European country. And yet, historically, there's been a very significant Muslim presence in the region, and indeed, the residue, if that's maybe not a very good term, the residue of that presence was in many respects at the very heart of those two of the conflicts that stemmed from the breakup of Yugoslavia. So, but I have to say, if you don't, if indeed you choose to read the book, and if you get to the two chapters on the Balkans, if you say to yourself, I don't think the Balkans are part of the Islamic world, skip over them. Just skip right on by. But if you do that, I think you're missing what is at least part of the story. Part of the story.
All right, second question, we can talk about the first one more later. Two new developments in the history of U.S. military involvement in the Middle East are two relatively new tools, which are one, use of private military contractors.
Right.
So maybe half of U.S. personnel in Iraq, actually private security firms. And two, drone warfare.
Right.
Does this change the narrative, or are these literally just new tools, but it doesn't fundamentally change your analysis?
To me, they're just new tools, and I sort of went over it very briefly in the talk. But one of the characteristics of this enterprise has been a willingness on the part of the United States to engage in a rather remarkable range of experimentation in terms of the weapons we emphasize, the approaches we take, the doctrines we're testing. It's not as if over the course of 3+ decades, the U.S. military has been doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. On the contrary, in different places at different times, the U.S. military has done quite different things. And I think an example is, the examples that you cite, once President Obama won the election in 2008, his election affirmed that the notion of invading and occupying countries with an expectation of transforming them as off the table. Remember the famous statement by Secretary of Defense Gates. This was right before he left office. Public statement, I think the cadets at West Point said something to the effect that anybody who recommends that the United States should invade another country in the Islamic world ought to have their head examined. So Obama inherited an ongoing war in which invade and occupy to transform had been tested and had been found wanting. Obama accepts that verdict, and Obama then, the Obama era, becomes an era of further experimentation. And the experimentation has emphasized using drones as instruments of assassination, although not exclusively drones. We also use manned aircraft, and has also emphasized the use of special operations forces, looking for ways to apply military power without boots on the ground. I mean, and we've seen further expression of that just in the last 3, 4, 5 days, where was it this morning, yesterday, an announcement of 200 additional special operations forces going to Iraq, Syria. And it seems pretty clear to me that the White House is playing games with the number of U.S. military personnel in the region. That the actual, I'd be willing to bet that the actual numbers are noticeably higher than the numbers that they are willing to acknowledge. Why is that? Because the president has said that we're in a war. That's the 4th Gulf War. We're in a war there. But the president has stated publicly that U.S. forces will not be in combat, and so he's trying to avoid the impression of a major investment of U.S. troops. And we are hoping that, in essence, we can wage a proxy war, that we can sufficiently train and motivate Iraqi forces and Syrian moderate rebels that they'll be able to win the fight without a great additional sacrifice of American blood, although there's a considerable outlay of American dollars. So I figured just the other day we've already spent something like $6 or $8 billion on the war against ISIS. Yes, sir.
You alluded to Mrs. Clinton's hegemonic tendencies. Do you think there's any glimmers of hope among her opponents in the prospect of the...
Well, her opponent is Senator Sanders, and I'd frankly like to see him get the nomination, but he's not gonna. And I say I'd like to see him get the nomination not because I know exactly where he stands on foreign policy and national security, because he actually hadn't said much about it. I mean, his campaign is about economic injustice, right? But it seems to me he's the one candidate who arguably might not adhere to what President Obama referred to as the Washington playbook. But given that it's looking pretty dim, his chances are looking pretty dim, we're going to have Washington playbook, regardless of who wins in November.
It seems there are some tendencies in Cruz and Trump that they won't quite buy into the bipartisan militarism, but outside of the debates anyhow.
I think my sense is this. I mean, first, you're right. I mean, there are some things that I'd put a bet on. One of them is, what would a Cruz as president actually do? I would not put a bet on that. I mean, it's really going to be uncharted territory. It seems to me that he comes across as an America firster, not as an America firster in the sense that he embraces something called isolationism, which never really existed, but because his calculation on the use of force is going to be connected to what's in it for us, as opposed to us narrowly defined as the United States of America, as opposed to more broadly defined as us, the U.S. and its allies. And I suspect that Cruz is kind of in that same camp. Neither one is anything like a, pacifist opponent of using military power. They've both vowed, I believe Trump and Cruz have both vowed, elect me and I will destroy ISIS. And Cruz's formulation, maybe it was just a slip of the tongue, Cruz's formulation suggested that he'd be open to the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't know how else you would make sand glow apart from using nuclear weapons. So it's fair to say they're not all the same. But I think that with regard to a penchant for using military power, they're more the same than they are different. It's like we're out of steam.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.